The silence in my apartment felt different that Tuesday evening, like the air itself was holding its breath. I stood in my doorway, keys still warm in my palm, staring at the empty spot on my kitchen counter where Aunt Patty's jewelry box had always sat. The mahogany box with its tarnished brass corners and faded velvet lining, the one that had been mine for exactly 6 months since her funeral. Gone. My laptop bag slid from my shoulder, hitting the hardwood floor with a dull thud that echoed through rooms that suddenly felt too spacious, too hollow. The late afternoon sun slanted through my living room window, casting long shadows across furniture that looked exactly the same as when I'd left for my client meeting that morning. Everything was in its place except for the one thing that mattered. I'm Sarah Chen, 28 years old, and until this moment I thought I understood my family pretty well. Okay, before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'm a freelance graphic designer, the practical one, the daughter who pays her own bills and never asks for money. The one who lives in downtown Riverside in a modest apartment that smells like vanilla candles and fresh coffee, surrounded by design books and half-finished client projects. The responsible one who always answers when they call. But standing there in my own space, staring at the empty counter, I felt something shift inside my chest like a foundation settling. The jewelry box wasn't just missing. It had been taken. I moved through my apartment methodically, checking every surface, every drawer, every closet shelf where I might have absent-mindedly placed it, but I knew I wouldn't find it. Aunt Patty's jewelry box lived on that counter, always. It was the first thing I saw every morning when I made coffee, the last thing I glimpsed before turning off the kitchen light each night. Its presence had become as constant as breathing. The box itself wasn't much to look at, honestly. Old, worn, with a music mechanism that hadn't worked in decades. Most of the jewelry inside was costume pieces from the 70s and 80s. Chunky gold-plated chains and earrings with missing stones. Nothing that would catch anyone's eye in a pawn shop. But it was mine. Aunt Patty had left it to me specifically in her will, along with a handwritten note that simply said, "For Sarah, who always saw beauty in forgotten things." My phone buzzed against my hip. A text from Mom. "Stopped by while you were out. Hope you don't mind. We took care of that old jewelry box for you. Come by the house tonight. We need to talk." I read the message 3 times, each word settling into my stomach like cold stones. They took care of it. Like it was a problem that needed solving. A burden they'd lifted from my shoulders. I stared at the screen until the words blurred, then slowly typed back a single word. The drive from my apartment to the family house in Maple Grove should have taken 15 minutes. That night, it felt like crossing time zones. I gripped the steering wheel of my Honda Civic, my knuckles bone white in the glow of streetlights, trying to prepare myself for whatever explanation they'd concocted. My parents, Linda and Bob Chen, lived in the same ranch house they'd bought in 1995, back when Dad still had his factory job, and Mom's retail manager salary actually meant something. These days, the house showed its age and their struggles. Peeling paint on the shutters, a front lawn that looked tired, newspapers stacked on the porch because they couldn't afford the cancellation fee. I'd offered to help with maintenance costs before, but Dad's pride ran deeper than his practicality. He'd rather let the house crumble than take money from his daughter. But taking my inheritance? Apparently that was different. I pulled into the driveway behind Dad's old pickup truck, the one with the cracked windshield he kept meaning to fix. The living room windows glowed warm yellow, and I could see Mom moving around inside, probably cleaning even though the house was already spotless. She cleaned when she was nervous, when she was preparing for something difficult. The front door was unlocked, like always. I stepped inside without knocking, same as I had since childhood, and immediately caught the scent of Mom's vanilla air freshener mixed with the faint medicinal smell that had lingered since Dad's heart medication changed last year. Everything looked exactly as it always did. The same beige carpet, the same floral couch they'd bought on credit in 2008, The same family photos arranged on the mantel like a shrine to better times. Mom appeared in the hallway, wiping her hands on a dish towel, even though dinner had been over for hours. Her dark hair was pulled back in its usual neat bun, and she wore the expression she always wore when she was about to deliver news she thought I wouldn't like, but should accept anyway. "Sarah, honey, you made good time," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Your father's in the living room. We wanted to talk to you about Aunt Patty's things." I followed her into the living room where Dad sat in his recliner, feet up, remote control balanced on his chest. The television was on but muted, casting flickering light across his weathered face. He looked older than his 59 years, worn down by layoffs and medical bills and the quiet desperation of trying to maintain dignity when everything was falling apart. He glanced up when I entered but didn't mute the TV or put his feet down. That was Dad's language. The careful distance he maintained when he knew he'd done something I might not approve of, but believed was necessary anyway. I sat on the edge of the couch, still wearing my jacket, hands folded in my lap. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken tensions, and the weight of words none of us wanted to say first. "Where's Aunt Patty's jewelry box?" I asked finally, my voice steady despite the tremor I felt in my chest. Mom's shoulders straightened slightly, the way they always did when she was about to justify something. "We took it to Anderson's Antiques downtown. The man there said it wasn't worth much, maybe $40 for the wood and brass, but we thought every little bit would help." "Help with what?" "The electric bill," Dad said without looking at me. "It's 3 months behind. They're threatening to shut us off next week." I nodded slowly, processing this information like I was reviewing a client's brand requirements. Methodical. Practical. "So you sold my inheritance to pay your electric bill." "It was just sitting there," Mom said quickly. "You never even opened it, never wore any of the jewelry. We thought you'd understand. You're always telling us to be practical about money." It was sitting there in my apartment, on my counter, because it was mine. "We know that, honey, but did you ask me first?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Mom's cleaning cloth twisted in her hands. Dad's eyes remained fixed on the silent television screen, watching some game show where contestants jumped around celebrating wins that would change their lives. "We didn't think you'd mind," Mom said finally. "It's not like it was valuable, just some old costume jewelry and a beat-up box. We were going to tell you tonight and give you the money. We thought you'd be proud of us for taking initiative instead of always asking you to bail us out." That last part hit like a physical blow. I'd never once made them feel bad about needing help. I'd never kept score or made them ask twice. When Dad's medication costs went up, I quietly started covering the difference. When Mom's hours got cut at the store, I began sending grocery money without being asked. I did it because I loved them, because family was supposed to take care of family. But I'd never given them permission to take care of themselves with my things. "How much did they give you?" I asked. $45, Dad said, still not looking at me. He said the jewelry was mostly junk, but the box had some decent craftsmanship. $45. 6 months of keeping Aunt Patty's memory alive on my kitchen counter, of running my fingers over the carved roses on the lid when I missed her laugh, of imagining all the secrets she might have kept in those small velvet compartments. Sold for less than a week's worth of groceries. "I need the receipt," I said. "What?" Mom looked confused. "Why?" "The receipt from Anderson's Antiques. I need it." They exchanged a look, one of those married couple conversations that happened entirely through facial expressions and shoulder movements. Finally, Mom disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a small white slip of paper, which she handed to me like she was passing along a parking ticket. I examined it carefully. Anderson's Antiques, downtown Riverside. Item description: Victorian jewelry box with contents. Purchase price: $45. Date: today. The ink was still fresh. "I'm going to get it back," I said, folding the receipt and slipping it into my jacket pocket. "Sarah, be reasonable," Mom said. "We needed the money. The electric company doesn't care about sentimental value. And I don't care about your electric bill." The words came out harder than I'd intended, but I didn't take them back. For 28 years, I'd been the reasonable one, The understanding one. The daughter who absorbed every crisis and disappointment without complaint. But they'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I stood up, keys already in my hand. I'm going to Anderson's Antiques tomorrow morning. I'm going to buy back what you had no right to sell. And then we're going to have a very different conversation about boundaries. It's just stuff, Dad said, finally looking at me. It's just old junk that was taking up space in your apartment. No, I said, turning toward the door. It was the last thing Aunt Patty gave me. It was mine. And you took it without asking because you decided it didn't matter. I was halfway to my car when Mom called after me. Sarah, please don't be dramatic about this. We'll pay you back when we can. I didn't answer. I didn't trust myself to speak without saying something that would burn bridges I might still want to cross someday. Instead, I got in my car and drove home through streets that looked exactly the same as they had an hour earlier, even though everything had changed. Back in my apartment, I stood in front of the empty space on my counter and felt the absence like a missing tooth. The spot looked wrong, naked, like a gap in a smile. I'd grown accustomed to the jewelry box's presence in ways I hadn't fully understood until it was gone. It had been my morning ritual to brush my fingers across its lid while waiting for coffee to brew, my evening comfort to see it there when I came home from long client meetings. More than that, it had been my last tangible connection to Aunt Patty, who'd died too young and too suddenly from a heart attack that no one saw coming. Patty had been Mom's older sister, but she'd never married, never had children of her own. Instead, she'd poured her attention into me, the niece who shared her love of vintage things and stories about family members who'd been gone for decades. When I was little, Patty would let me play with the jewelry in that box while she told me stories about each piece. The pearl earrings, that weren't really pearls but had belonged to her mother. The charm bracelet she'd bought in San Francisco during her one big adventure in 1973. The wedding ring that had never been worn because the engagement had ended badly, but she'd kept it anyway because it reminded her that some risks were worth taking. The box itself had been her grandmother's, handcrafted by someone whose name was lost to time but whose skill was evident in every dovetail joint and carved detail. It had traveled from whatever country her great-grandparents had left behind, survived the Depression, multiple moves, and decades of family upheavals. It had endured everything except my parents' financial crisis and their assumption that I wouldn't mind sacrificing my inheritance for their convenience. I made coffee even though it was past 9 o'clock, needing something to do with my hands while my mind tried to process what had happened. As the machine gurgled and hissed, I found myself staring at the empty counter. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Space and feeling something harder than anger settling in my chest. This wasn't just about the jewelry box. This was about the pattern of assumptions my family had been making about me for years. They assumed I'd always say yes when they needed help. They assumed I'd never ask questions about where the money went, or whether they were making any effort to solve their own problems. They assumed my success as a freelancer meant I had unlimited resources and unlimited patience for their financial emergencies. Most of all, they assumed that because I was practical and generous, I didn't have emotional attachments that mattered as much as their immediate needs. They'd made the same calculation about Aunt Patty's jewelry box that they made about everything else in my life. If it wasn't obviously valuable, if it didn't serve a clear purpose, if it looked like something they could convert into cash without consequences, then it was fair game. My feelings about it were secondary to their practical needs. But what they didn't understand, what they'd never bothered to ask about, was that the jewelry box represented something more valuable than money. It represented the feeling of being chosen, of being trusted with family history, of being seen as someone worthy of inheritance, even if that inheritance wasn't worth much to anyone else. Aunt Patty had specifically left it to me, not to Mom or Dad or my brother Marcus, who still lived in their basement and contributed nothing to household expenses. She'd chosen me because she knew I'd appreciate not just the objects themselves, but the stories that came with them, the sense of connection to women I'd never met, but whose legacy I carried forward. And my parents had sold all of that for $45. I sipped my coffee and tried to calm the rage that was building behind my ribs like pressure in a steam engine. Getting angry wouldn't solve anything. Getting strategic would. Anderson's Antiques had been in downtown Riverside for as long as I could remember, run by an elderly man who knew the real value of things even if he didn't always pay it. If the jewelry box was still there, if someone hadn't already bought it, I could probably get it back for the same $45 plus whatever premium he charged for the inconvenience. But that was just the beginning. Tomorrow, I'd go to the antique shop and reclaim what was mine. Then I'd have a longer conversation with my parents about respect and boundaries, and the difference between helping family and enabling them to help themselves to whatever they wanted from my life. The coffee tasted bitter, but I drank it anyway, standing in my kitchen and staring at the space where my inheritance used to live. Outside my window, Riverside settled into its usual evening quiet, streetlights casting pools of yellow light on empty sidewalks. Most people were probably settling in for the night, watching television or reading, or having normal conversations with family members who understood basic concepts, like permission and respect. I wasn't most people. I was Sarah Chen, the practical daughter who'd just learned that being practical didn't protect you from being taken advantage of. Tomorrow, I'd start teaching my family the difference between generosity and being a pushover. But tonight, I just missed Aunt Patty and wished she was still alive to tell me what she'd really intended when she left me that jewelry box. I had a feeling there was more to the story than anyone realized, including me. Anderson's Antiques occupied a narrow storefront on 3rd Street that looked like it hadn't changed since 1952. The wooden sign above the door had faded to an indeterminate brown color, and the windows displayed the kind of eclectic collection that made you wonder if the owner was a genius or just couldn't bear to throw anything away. Vintage typewriters sat next to ceramic garden gnomes, which neighbored a collection of military medals and a dusty display case. I pushed through the door at exactly 9:15 Wednesday morning, 15 minutes after opening time. A bell attached to the doorframe announced my arrival with a sound that probably hadn't been tuned since the Eisenhower administration. The shop smelled like old wood, dust, and the peculiar mustiness that comes from decades of other people's belongings changing hands. Behind the counter sat a man who could have been anywhere between 60 and 80, with silver hair that looked like he'd styled it with his fingers, and reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. He was examining what appeared to be a pocket watch with a magnifying glass, completely absorbed in whatever tiny mechanism had caught his attention. I approached the counter slowly, taking in the organized chaos around me. Every available surface was covered with items that told stories I'd never know. A rocking chair that had probably soothed countless babies to sleep. A set of china that had hosted holiday dinners for families long since scattered. A collection of books whose pages had been turned by hands that were now dust. "Excuse me," I said, placing the receipt on the counter between us. "I need to buy something back." The man looked up from his pocket watch, blinking as his eyes adjusted to seeing something farther away than the tiny gears he'd been studying. His face was kind but weathered, like leather that had been well cared for but extensively used. "Buy something back?" He set down his magnifying glass and picked up the receipt, squinting at it even though he was still wearing his reading glasses. "Oh, the jewelry box. Beautiful piece, that one. Victorian era, if I'm not mistaken. Someone knew what they were doing when they made it." "My parents brought it in yesterday," I said. "They didn't have permission to sell it." His eyebrows rose slightly, creating new wrinkles across his forehead. "I see. Family disagreement? Something like that? Is it still here?" He studied me for a moment, taking in my jeans and sweater, my determined expression, the way I was gripping my car keys like they might anchor me to something solid. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him because he nodded and disappeared into the back room without another word. I waited, listening to the sounds of boxes being moved and items being shifted around. The shop felt like a library, where whispered conversations were the loudest sounds allowed. Somewhere in the back, a clock ticked with the steady rhythm of time that had outlasted its original owner. When he returned, he was carrying Aunt Patty's jewelry box, and seeing it again hit me harder than I'd expected. The mahogany wood caught the morning light streaming through the front windows, highlighting the intricate roses carved around the edges. The brass corners were still tarnished, still bearing the tiny dents and scratches that came from decades of careful use. "Here she is," he said, setting it gently on the counter. "I have to say, I was surprised when they brought it in. This isn't the kind of thing people usually sell unless they're desperate." "They were desperate," I said, reaching out to touch the lid. The wood felt warm under my fingers, familiar in a way that made my chest tight. "How much to buy it back?" "Well, I paid $45 for it, so I'd normally ask for $60 or $70. That's how this business works." He paused, studying my face again. "But something tells me there's more to this story than a simple family disagreement." I looked up at him, surprised by the gentleness in his voice. "It was my inheritance. My aunt left it to me specifically. They took it from my apartment without asking." He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the counter. "What was your aunt's name?" "Patricia Williams." Everyone called her Patty. His expression changed, shifting from professional courtesy to something more personal. "Patty Williams. Worked at the library for 30 years. Always wore those colorful scarves." "You knew her?" "She used to come in here every few months, looking for books about antiques and local history. Always asked the most interesting questions." He smiled, the kind of sad smile that comes with remembering someone who won't be making any more visits. "She mentioned having a niece who appreciated old things. I assume that was you." "Yes, that was me." He nodded slowly, then did something that completely surprised me. He opened the jewelry box. The hinges moved smoothly, despite the box's age, revealing the red velvet interior I remembered from childhood. But instead of the jumbled collection of costume jewelry I expected to see, the compartments were empty except for a single item in the center section. A small brass key. "That's interesting," I said, leaning closer. "That wasn't there before." "Actually, it was," he said. "I found it when I was examining the contents yesterday." It was hidden under the velvet lining in the bottom compartment. Someone had cut a small slit in the fabric and tucked it inside. Very cleverly done. I almost missed it entirely. I stared at the key, trying to process this information. It was old, made of brass that had developed the same patina as the box's corners. Not the kind of key that opened modern locks, but something that belonged to an earlier era when keys were made by hand and meant to last for generations. "Aunt Patty never mentioned anything about a key," I said. "Hidden things usually stay hidden for a reason," he said. "Your aunt strikes me as the kind of person who would have had her reasons for keeping this secret." I picked up the key, feeling its weight in my palm. It was heavier than I'd expected. Substantial in a way that suggested it opened something important. The head of the key was decorated with a small engraved pattern that looked like intertwining vines or flowers. Too detailed to make out clearly without better light. "Do you have any idea what it might open?" "Could be anything. Safety deposit box, maybe. Or an old trunk. People used to lock up their valuables in furniture that required special keys." He paused, watching my expression. "Your aunt never mentioned having anything locked away?" "No. But then again, she was always full of surprises." I closed my fingers around the key, feeling its edges press into my palm. "How much for the box and everything in it?" "For Patty's niece? $45. Same as I paid. Consider it a favor to an old customer." I handed him the money without hesitation, grateful for his kindness but also eager to get home and examine the key more carefully. He wrapped the jewelry box in brown paper with the careful attention of someone who understood that some objects carried more value than their price tag suggested. "If you figure out what that key opens," he said as I headed toward the door, "I'd love to hear the story. Your aunt always had the best stories." The drive home felt different than it had the night before. Instead of the hollow anger that had consumed me after discovering the theft, I felt a buzzing anticipation that made it hard to sit still. Whatever Aunt Patty had hidden, whatever secret she'd kept locked away, she'd left me the means to discover it. Back in my apartment, I placed the jewelry box in its proper spot on the kitchen counter and immediately felt the space settle back into its correct configuration. But now the familiar object held new mysteries. I opened it again, running my fingers along the velvet lining until I found the small slit where the key had been hidden. The cut was almost invisible, made with the precision of someone who knew how to alter fabric without destroying it. Aunt Patty had worked briefly as a seamstress before taking her job at the library, and her sewing skills had remained sharp throughout her life. She'd altered countless dresses for me over the years, always managing to make inexpensive clothes look like they'd been tailored by professionals. I held the key up to the window, studying it in better light. The engraved pattern on the head was definitely floral, roses and vines that seemed to match the carved decorations on the jewelry box itself. It was as if the key and the box had been made as a set, designed to complement each other in ways that weren't immediately obvious. But what could Aunt Patty have owned that required such an elaborate key? Her house had been sold 6 months ago to cover her medical bills and funeral expenses. The contents had been distributed among family members or donated to charity. If there had been anything valuable enough to require a special hiding place, surely someone would have mentioned it. Unless no one else knew about it. I thought about Aunt Patty's house, the small Victorian on Willowbrook Street where she'd lived for almost 40 years. I'd helped clean it out after the funeral, packing up books and kitchen utensils and the 1,000 small objects that accumulate over a lifetime. The house had felt empty even before we started removing her belongings, as if her spirit had already moved on to whatever came next. But what if we'd missed something? What if there was a hidden compartment or a locked drawer that we'd never thought to look for? Old houses were famous for their secret spaces. Built-in hiding places where previous generations had stored everything from love letters to emergency cash. My phone rang, interrupting my speculation. Mom's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. But curiosity won out over caution. "Hi, Mom." "Sarah, honey, I've been thinking about our conversation last night." Her voice had the carefully modulated tone she used when she was trying to smooth over conflict without actually apologizing. "I want you to know that we really didn't mean to upset you. We just thought you'd want us to be practical about money." "I got the jewelry box back," I said. "You what?" "Sarah, we needed that money for the electric bill." "Then you should have asked me for help instead of stealing my inheritance." "We didn't steal anything," she said, her voice sharpening. "We sold something that was just sitting there collecting dust. You never even looked at it." Actually, I looked at it every day, and apparently I wasn't looking closely enough. I walked to the kitchen counter, running my finger along the jewelry box's carved edge. "Did you know there was a key hidden inside it?" Silence on the other end of the line. Then, cautiously, "What kind of key?" "I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out." I paused, letting her absorb this information. Did Aunt Patty ever mention having anything locked away? Anything valuable that she might have kept secret? "Patty was always dramatic about things," Mom said dismissively. "She probably hid that key to make some old trinket seem more important than it was. You know how she loved her mysteries and stories." "Maybe. Or maybe she knew exactly what she was doing when she left me that jewelry box." "Sarah, please don't let your imagination run away with you. Patty was wonderful, but she wasn't wealthy. She worked at the library her whole life. Whatever that key opens, it's probably just more old junk. We'll see." "Look, about the electric bill," Mom continued, switching back to the topic that actually concerned her. "We really do need help. They're going to shut off the power on Friday if we don't come up with $300. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar tug of guilt and responsibility that had shaped most of my adult relationship with my parents. $300 wasn't an enormous amount of money for me, especially not for an emergency. Under normal circumstances, I would have already transferred the money and told them not to worry about paying it back. But these weren't normal circumstances. These were the circumstances that came after your family violated your trust and dismissed your feelings as unimportant. "Have you talked to Marcus about contributing?" I asked. "You know your brother doesn't have any money. Marcus is 31 years old and lives in your house rent-free. Maybe it's time for him to get a job and start contributing to the household expenses." "It's not that simple, Sarah. The job market is terrible, and he's been having a hard time since Angela left him." "That was 2 years ago, Mom. Some people take longer to get back on their feet." I looked at the key in my palm, this small brass object that represented mysteries I didn't yet understand and possibilities I was just beginning to imagine. Whatever Aunt Patty had locked away, whatever secret she'd trusted me to uncover, It felt more important than enabling my family's dysfunction for another month. I'll think about it, I said finally. What do you mean you'll think about it? Sarah, they're going to shut off our electricity. Then maybe you and Dad and Marcus need to figure out a solution that doesn't involve taking things from my apartment, or assuming I'll always bail you out. I hung up before she could respond, knowing that if I stayed on the line any longer, I'd either give in to the guilt or say something that would make the situation worse. Instead, I sat down at my kitchen table and really examined the key for the first time. It was definitely old, probably dating back to the same era as the jewelry box. The brass had aged to a warm golden color, and the engraved roses showed the kind of detail that came from handcrafting rather than machine production. The shaft was long and slender, designed for a lock that required precision rather than brute force. I tried to think about everything I knew about Aunt Patty's life, looking for clues about what she might have wanted to keep locked away. She'd never married, but she'd had relationships. She'd worked at the library, but she'd also traveled more than anyone else in our family. She'd owned her house outright, bought with an inheritance from her own grandmother, and she'd lived modestly but comfortably. Most importantly, she'd been the keeper of family stories. Patty was the one who remembered which cousin had run away to join the circus, which uncle had lost everything in a poker game, which great-aunt had supposedly buried gold coins in her backyard before dying without revealing their location. She collected family legends the way other people collected stamps, preserving stories that might otherwise have been forgotten. What if one of those stories had been more than just a story? I opened my laptop and did something I probably should have done months ago. I searched for Patricia Williams and Riverside, Oregon, looking for any public records that might give me a clue about her finances or property holdings. What I found surprised me. According to county records, Aunt Patty had owned more than just her house on Willowbrook Street. She'd also owned a small storage unit downtown, one that had been paid up for the next 5 years. The payment had been made just 2 weeks before her death, in a lump sum that represented a significant chunk of money for someone living on a librarian's pension. A storage unit that would require a key to open. I grabbed my jacket and car keys, feeling the brass key warm in my pocket as I headed for the door. If I was right, if this key opened whatever Aunt Patty had been storing downtown, then I was about to discover why she'd been so careful to hide it in a place where only someone who truly cared about her belongings would think to look. The Riverside self-storage facility sat on the edge of downtown, a collection of beige metal buildings surrounded by chain-link fence and security cameras. It was the kind of place where people stored furniture during moves, holiday decorations between seasons, and memories they couldn't bear to throw away but didn't have space to keep. I pulled up to the office, a small building that looked like a modular home someone had dropped next to the storage units as an afterthought. The parking lot was mostly empty, except for a few cars that probably belonged to people dealing with the accumulated possessions of their own complicated lives. Inside, a woman who looked like she'd been managing storage facilities since before I was born sat behind a desk covered with rental agreements and coffee-stained paperwork. Her nameplate read, Dorothy Chen, and I wondered briefly if we might be distantly related. In a town the size of Riverside, most families had branches that had spread in unexpected directions. "Can I help you?" she asked, looking up from whatever form she'd been filling out. "I need to access my aunt's storage unit, Patricia Williams. She passed away 6 months ago." Dorothy's expression softened immediately. "Oh, Patty, I was so sorry to hear about her passing. She was one of our longtime customers, always paid her rent early, and never caused any trouble." She paused, studying me with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to be cautious about family disputes. "Do you have authorization to access her unit?" I'd been afraid of this question. "I have her will," I said, which was true even though the will didn't specifically mention a storage unit. "And I found this key in her belongings." I placed the brass key on the counter between us. Dorothy picked it up, examining it with the same professional interest that the antique dealer had shown. "This isn't one of our keys," she said. "We use standard padlocks. This looks like it goes to something much older." My heart sank a little. "Are you sure?" Positive, but that doesn't mean it's not connected to her unit somehow. She turned to her computer, typing in what I assumed was Aunt Patty's information. Let me see here. Patricia Williams, Unit 47. Paid up through next year. Can I see it? Dorothy hesitated, clearly weighing policy against compassion. Normally, I'd need to see death certificates and legal documentation. But if you're family and you have her key, I suppose it wouldn't hurt to take a look. Sometimes people store things inside their units that require separate keys. She grabbed a master key from a hook behind her desk and led me outside, past rows of identical storage units that looked like oversized mailboxes lined up in military formation. Unit 47 was near the back of the complex, tucked between units that looked like they hadn't been opened in years. Here we are, Dorothy said, examining the padlock that secured the rolling door. This is definitely one of ours, but if your aunt left you that brass key, there might be something inside that it opens. She unlocked the padlock and helped me roll up the metal door, revealing the contents of Aunt Patty's secret storage space. What I saw made me take a step backward in surprise. The unit was filled with furniture, but not the kind of furniture that usually ended up in storage. These were antiques, real antiques, the kind of pieces that belonged in museums or the homes of serious collectors. A mahogany secretary desk with intricate inlay work, a set of chairs that looked like they'd been made for European royalty, a grandfather clock that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. But it was the item in the center of the space that made my breath catch in my throat. A massive trunk, black with brass corners and elaborate metalwork, sitting like a treasure chest in the middle of what was clearly a treasure room. My goodness, Dorothy whispered. I had no idea Patty had anything like this. She always said she was just storing some old family furniture. I walked toward the trunk slowly, pulling the brass key from my pocket. The keyhole in the trunk's elaborate locking mechanism looked like it would fit the key perfectly. My hands were shaking as I inserted the key and turned it. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the storage unit like a gunshot. Inside the trunk was something that changed everything I thought I knew about Aunt Patty, about my family, and about the inheritance she'd really left me. Documents. Stacks and stacks of documents, each one carefully preserved in protective sleeves. But these weren't just family papers or old photographs. These were stock certificates, bonds, bank statements, investment records going back decades. At the top of the pile was a letter addressed to me, written in Aunt Patty's careful handwriting. My dear Sarah, it began. If you're reading this, it means you found the key, and were curious enough to follow where it led. I always knew you had the persistence to solve puzzles, which is why I chose you to inherit not just my jewelry box, but everything it was designed to protect. I sank down onto the floor of the storage unit, letter in one hand, surrounded by what was apparently a fortune that had been hidden in plain sight for decades. Whatever game my family thought they'd been playing when they sold my worthless inheritance, they'd just lost in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. Dorothy was staring at the contents of the trunk with an expression that suggested she was recalculating everything she thought she knew about quiet librarians and their capacity for keeping secrets. I think, she said carefully, you're going to want to take your time going through all of this. I nodded, still reading Aunt Patty's letter, still trying to process the magnitude of what she'd entrusted to me. My family had sold my inheritance for $45. Never knowing that they'd actually been trying to sell the key to a fortune that would change everything. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. Aunt Patty's letter contained instructions that felt like they'd been written by someone who understood exactly how the discovery would unfold. She'd anticipated my shock, my confusion, and most importantly, my need for guidance about what to do next. The portfolio you'll find in this trunk represents 43 years of careful investing, the letter continued. I started with a small inheritance from our grandmother when I was 25, and I've been adding to it steadily ever since. The current value, as of my last quarterly statement, is approximately $8 million. I had to read that number 3 times before it sank in. $8 million. Hidden in a storage unit in downtown Riverside, accumulated by a woman who clipped coupons and drove the same car for 15 years, because she said there was no point in replacing something that still worked perfectly well. I lived modestly by choice, not necessity, the letter explained, as if Aunt Patty could read my thoughts from beyond the grave. I wanted to see what careful planning and patience could accomplish. More than that, I wanted to leave something meaningful to the next generation, something that would provide security and opportunities that our family has never had. Dorothy had tactfully retreated to give me privacy, but I could see her through the open doorway of the storage unit, pacing back and forth in front of the office like someone who'd stumbled into a movie and wasn't sure what her role was supposed to be. I continued reading, my hands trembling slightly as the magnitude of what Aunt Patty had accomplished became clear. She'd invested in blue-chip stocks, municipal bonds, and mutual funds, with the methodical precision she'd brought to cataloging books at the library. Every purchase had been researched, every decision documented in handwriting that grew more confident over the decades. The jewelry box was my way of ensuring that only the right person would find this treasure, the letter continued. I chose you, Sarah, because you're the only one in our family who has ever shown real appreciation for history, for the stories that objects can tell, for the value of things that aren't immediately obvious. I trusted that you would be curious enough to examine the box carefully and persistent enough to follow the clues wherever they led. A chill ran down my spine as I realized how perfectly she'd orchestrated this discovery. The jewelry box sitting on my counter for 6 months, becoming such a familiar part of my daily routine that I stopped really seeing it. My parents' theft forcing me to reclaim it and examine it more closely than I ever had before. The antique dealer who noticed details that everyone else had missed. Even Dorothy's willingness to bend the rules for family, allowing me access to a storage unit that technically required more paperwork than I'd brought. It was as if Aunt Patty had planned for every contingency, including the possibility that my inheritance might be threatened by people who didn't understand its true value. I've included detailed instructions for transferring everything into your name, the letter continued. The bank statements and account information are all here, along with contact details for my financial advisor, David Morrison at First National. He's been expecting to hear from you, though he doesn't know the exact timing of when you might discover all of this. David Morrison. The name was familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. Then I remembered. He was James Morrison's older brother, the one who'd moved to Portland to work for a larger investment firm before returning to Riverside a few years ago. I'd gone to high school with James, who now managed the local branch of First National Bank. David has been managing this portfolio for the past 8 years, Aunt Patty's letter explained. He's someone you can trust, someone who understands that real wealth is built slowly and protected carefully. He'll help you navigate the transfer process and explain your options for managing this inheritance. I set the letter aside and began examining the contents of the trunk more systematically. The organization was extraordinary, everything sorted into categories and labeled with the same attention to detail that Aunt Patty had brought to her library work. Stock certificates in one section, bond documentation in another, bank statements arranged chronologically in a third. The numbers were staggering. Individual stock holdings worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Municipal bonds that had been accumulating interest for decades. A diversified portfolio that showed exactly the kind of steady, conservative growth that turned modest savings into substantial wealth over time. But it was the bank statements that really made my breath catch. The most recent statement, dated just 2 weeks before Aunt Patty's death, showed a checking account balance of $127,000 and a savings account with another $340,000. Cash, just sitting there, earning interest, waiting for someone who knew it existed to claim it. I thought about my parents, struggling to pay a $300 electric bill, selling my inheritance for $45 because they couldn't imagine any other solution to their financial problems. The irony was so complete it felt like something from a dark comedy. They'd literally thrown away the key to a fortune because they couldn't see past their immediate desperation. My phone buzzed with a text message. Marcus, my older brother, who'd been living in my parents' basement for 2 years without contributing to household expenses or making any apparent effort to change his situation. Mom says you're being weird about some old jewelry box. Can you just give them the money for the electric bill? It's not like you can't afford it. I stared at the message, feeling something cold and hard settle in my chest. Not like I couldn't afford it. As if my ability to help automatically created an obligation to help, regardless of how they'd treated me or what they'd done to create their current crisis. I typed back a single word, no. 3 dots appeared immediately, indicating that Marcus was typing a response. Then they disappeared. Then they appeared again. Whatever he was trying to say was apparently too complicated for his usual communication style. Finally, a longer message appeared. What's your problem? They raised you, fed you, put a roof over your head for 18 years. You can't help them with one electric bill? I looked around the storage unit, at the antique furniture worth more than most people's houses, at the trunk full of financial documents that represented a lifetime of careful planning and delayed gratification. Then I looked at my phone and typed a response that felt like drawing a line in the sand. They had no right to take things from my apartment. They had no right to sell something that didn't belong to them. And you have no right to lecture me about family obligations when you've been living off them for 2 years without contributing anything. Send. The 3 dots appeared and disappeared several times before Marcus apparently gave up trying to formulate a response. I turned my phone to silent and slipped it back into my pocket. Whatever family drama was unfolding at the house in Maple Grove, it would have to unfold without my participation. I spent the next 2 hours going through every document in the trunk, taking photographs of account numbers and contact information, making notes about which institutions held which investments. The scope of Aunt Patty's financial empire was breathtaking. She'd invested in everything from local utility companies to international mutual funds, always choosing stability over speculation, growth over gambling. More than that, she'd kept meticulous records of every transaction, every dividend payment, every decision to buy or sell. Reading through her investment journals was like watching a masterclass in patience and discipline. She'd weathered market crashes by holding steady, celebrated bull markets by staying conservative, and consistently reinvested her earnings rather than spending them on luxuries she didn't need. The most important thing to remember, her letter concluded, is that this money represents choices. The choice to live below your means so you can invest the difference. The choice to think in decades rather than months. The choice to value security over status, substance over style. I hope you'll use this inheritance to create the kind of life that makes you genuinely happy, not just the kind of life that looks impressive to other people. At the bottom of the letter, in smaller handwriting that looked like it had been added as an afterthought, she'd written one final instruction. Don't let anyone else's financial emergencies become your emotional emergencies. You have the resources now to help people you choose to help, in ways you choose to help them. Use that power wisely. It was as if she'd known exactly what would happen, exactly how my family would react to having their financial safety net removed, exactly how they'd try to guilt me into resuming my role as their personal bank. I closed the trunk carefully, locked it with the brass key, and helped Dorothy roll down the storage unit door. The padlock clicked back into place, with a sound that felt like sealing away one chapter of my life so another could begin. Will you be back tomorrow? Dorothy asked as we walked toward the office. Probably. I need to arrange transportation for some of those pieces, and I want to go through everything more carefully. I paused, looking back at the storage unit that contained more wealth than I'd ever imagined possessing. Do you mind if I ask how long Aunt Patty had been renting this space? Let me check. Dorothy consulted her computer when we reached the office. Looks like she's been a customer for, almost 20 years. Always paid annually, always in cash. Never missed a payment or caused any problems. 20 years. Aunt Patty had been quietly accumulating and storing wealth for 20 years, building a legacy that no one in our family had suspected existed. She'd attended every holiday dinner, every birthday party, every family gathering, listening to conversations about money troubles and job losses and financial stress, never once mentioning that she had the resources to solve every problem anyone was facing. But she'd also never volunteered to become the family's financial savior. She'd watched my parents struggle with mortgage payments and medical bills, watched Marcus drift from one failed venture to another, watched me quietly subsidize everyone else's poor decisions, and she'd chosen to keep her wealth secret. Why? The answer came to me as I drove home through downtown Riverside, past the library where Aunt Patty had worked for 3 decades, past the modest restaurants where she'd eaten lunch every day, past the small shops where she'd bought her sensible clothes and practical furniture. She'd kept her wealth secret because she understood something about money that the rest of our family had never learned. That having it didn't automatically create an obligation to share it with people who hadn't made the same sacrifices to acquire it. Aunt Patty had lived below her means for 43 years. She'd driven used cars, lived in the same house without major renovations, worn clothes until they wore out rather than replacing them when fashions changed. Every dollar she'd invested had been a dollar she'd chosen not to spend on something else, a small sacrifice multiplied across decades, until it became substantial wealth. My parents, by contrast, had spent every dollar they'd ever earned, and then borrowed against future earnings to spend even more. They'd upgraded their cars when the old ones still ran, renovated their kitchen when the old one was perfectly functional, and consistently chosen immediate gratification over long-term security. Marcus had never even tried to build wealth, preferring to drift from one temporary situation to another, always expecting someone else to provide the stability he wouldn't create for himself. And I'd been enabling all of them, smoothing over the consequences of their choices, making their poor decisions feel comfortable, instead of encouraging them to make better ones. Aunt Patty had seen all of this, understood all of this, and made a different choice. She'd chosen to keep her wealth secret until she could pass it to someone who would appreciate not just the money itself, but the discipline and sacrifice that had created it. Someone who would use it wisely instead of allowing it to become another source of family drama and resentment. My phone was still on silent, but I could see that I'd missed 7 calls and 12 text messages. The family crisis was escalating, and my refusal to immediately solve their latest emergency was apparently causing panic. I didn't check the messages. Instead, I drove straight to First National Bank. The building occupied a corner of downtown Riverside that managed to look both historic and modern, like someone had carefully restored a 1920s bank while updating it for contemporary business. James Morrison's name was painted on the window of the corner office, along with his title, branch manager. I walked through the main lobby, past customers making deposits and withdrawals, past the customer service desk where people solved routine banking problems, toward the office where I hoped to solve the most extraordinary banking problem of my life. James looked up from his computer when I knocked on his open door. We'd been friendly in high school, not close friends, but part of the same social circle that included people who took school seriously and planned to leave Riverside for college. He'd surprised everyone by coming back after getting his business degree, choosing to build his career in the same small town where he'd grown up. Sarah Chen, he said, standing up to shake my hand. I heard you were doing graphic design work. How's that going? Really well, thanks. Actually, I'm here about something else. I need to speak with David Morrison. I believe he's your brother? He is. Investment advisor. Works out of the office upstairs. James's expression became more professional, the casual friendliness shifting into banking mode. Is this about opening an investment account? It's about an existing account. A large one. I think I need to arrange a transfer of assets. Something in my tone must have conveyed the seriousness of the situation, because James didn't ask any more questions. He simply picked up his phone and dialed an extension. David, I have Sarah Chen here in my office. She needs to speak with you about an asset transfer. Yes, I think it might be that situation you mentioned. Okay, we'll be right up. He hung up and looked at me with an expression that was part curiosity, part respect. My brother's been waiting for this call for 6 months. The elevator ride to the second floor felt like traveling between 2 different worlds. The main banking floor had been busy with ordinary people conducting ordinary business. The investment services floor was quieter, more subdued, decorated with the kind of understated elegance that suggested serious money was discussed here on a regular basis. David Morrison's office was larger than his brother's, with windows that overlooked the entire downtown area. He was older than James by maybe 5 years, with graying hair and the kind of calm demeanor that probably came from helping people manage substantial wealth without getting excited about it. Ms. Chen, he said, standing to greet me. I've been wondering when you'd contact me. Please, have a seat. You've been expecting me? Patricia Williams was very specific about her instructions. She said that when her niece Sarah contacted me about transferring assets, I should be prepared to help with a substantial portfolio. He opened a file cabinet and withdrew a folder that was considerably thicker than I'd expected. She also said you might be discovering the existence of this portfolio under unusual circumstances. I couldn't help but smile. That's definitely accurate. She was a remarkable woman. One of the most disciplined investors I've ever worked with. David opened the folder and spread several documents across his desk. Before we begin the transfer process, I should probably explain exactly what you're inheriting. The numbers he showed me were even larger than what I'd seen in the storage unit. The market had performed well over the past 6 months, and several of Aunt Patty's long-term holdings had appreciated significantly. The total value of the portfolio was now approaching $2 million. This doesn't include the cash accounts, David continued, which total approximately $500,000. Or the personal property she mentioned in her instructions. Personal property? The antique furniture and collectibles. She had them appraised last year for insurance purposes. The total value was approximately $400,000. I sat back in my chair, trying to process numbers that seemed to belong to someone else's life. The jewelry box that my parents had sold for $45 had been the key to assets worth nearly $4 million. There are tax implications, of course, David continued, but the estate planning was handled very carefully. Most of this will transfer to you without significant tax consequences. How long will the transfer process take? For the investment accounts, probably 2 weeks once we have all the necessary paperwork. The cash accounts could be transferred more quickly, within a few days. He paused, studying my expression. I have to ask, are you planning to make any immediate changes to the investment strategy? I don't know enough about investing to make changes, I said honestly. Aunt Patty obviously knew what she was doing. I'd rather learn from her approach than try to reinvent it. David smiled for the first time since I'd entered his office. That's exactly what she hoped you'd say. She left very specific instructions about maintaining the current allocation while you learn about portfolio management. She also suggested that you might want to consider increasing your monthly contributions once the accounts are in your name. Monthly contributions. I thought about the automatic transfers I'd been making to my parents' accounts, the steady drain on my own savings that had prevented me from building wealth the way Aunt Patty had. All that money flowing toward people who spent it immediately instead of investing it wisely was about to become available for my own financial future. I'd like to start the transfer process as soon as possible, I said. Excellent. I'll need some documentation from you, and we'll need to schedule a longer meeting to go through all the account details. David handed me a list of required documents. But I can start the preliminary paperwork today. As I reviewed the list, my phone buzzed with what felt like the 100th message of the day. This time it was Dad, and his text was shorter and more direct than the others had been. Electric company called. Power gets shut off tomorrow morning unless we pay. Please call. I showed the message to David, who read it with the neutral expression of someone who'd probably seen every possible family financial drama play out in his office. Family emergency? He asked. Something like that. I turned off my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. How quickly can I access some of the cash accounts? Once we verify your identity and complete the initial transfer paperwork, probably by tomorrow afternoon. Were you planning to help them? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications about family obligations and financial boundaries, and the difference between helping and enabling. David had worked with Aunt Patty for 8 years. He'd probably heard her thoughts about our family's financial habits, her concerns about creating dependency instead of encouraging independence. I'm planning to make some decisions about how I want to use this inheritance, I said carefully. And those decisions are going to be based on what I think Aunt Patty would have wanted, not what other people expect from me. David nodded approvingly. She said you'd understand the difference. We spent another hour going through paperwork and procedures, setting up appointments for the following week, discussing the logistics of transferring millions of dollars from one person's name to another. By the time I left the bank, the sun was setting over downtown Riverside, casting long shadows across streets that looked exactly the same as they had that morning but felt completely different to me. I was no longer Sarah Chen, the practical daughter who quietly subsidized her family's poor financial decisions. I was Sarah Chen, the inheritor of a fortune that had been built through decades of careful planning and disciplined saving. I had choices now, Real choices. About how to live and who to help and what kind of future to create. But first, I had to decide what to do about an electric bill that would be overdue in less than 24 hours. And a family that had no idea they'd just lost their financial safety net to someone who was finally learning the difference between generosity and enablement. The call came at 6:30 Thursday morning, while I was still in bed reviewing Aunt Patty's investment journals by lamplight. Mom's ringtone cut through the quiet of my apartment like an alarm, urgent and demanding in a way that made my chest tighten before I even answered. "Sarah, thank God you picked up." Her voice was strained, higher-pitched than usual, carrying the edge of someone who'd been awake all night worrying. "The electric company truck is already here. They're disconnecting our power in 20 minutes, unless we can give them a confirmation number for payment." I set down the journal and walked to my kitchen window, looking out at the morning light filtering through downtown Riverside. Somewhere across town, my family was experiencing the natural consequences of years of poor financial decisions, and they expected me to solve their crisis with a phone call and a credit card number. "Have you called Marcus?" I asked. "Marcus doesn't have any money, you know that." "Sarah, please, I'm begging you. It's $347. That's nothing for you." "Nothing for me." The assumption embedded in those words felt like a slap, as if my ability to earn money automatically created an obligation to spend it on their emergencies. As if my financial stability existed solely for the purpose of subsidizing their instability. "It's not nothing," I said. "It's the consequence of not paying your bills on time." "What has gotten into you?" Mom's voice cracked with something between frustration and desperation. "This isn't like you. You've always been there for us when we needed help. I've always enabled you when you refused to help yourselves." The silence that followed was so complete, I wondered if the call had disconnected. Then I heard Dad's voice in the background, asking what I'd said. Mom's muffled response was too quiet to make out, but Dad's reaction was clear enough. "Give me the phone," he said. "Sarah." Dad's voice was different from Mom's, quieter but harder, carrying the authority he'd wielded when I was young, and his word was final. "I don't know what's happened to you, but this attitude stops now. We raised you better than this." "You raised me to clean up your messes," I said. "But you didn't raise me to let people steal from me and then demand I thank them for it. Nobody stole anything. We sold some old junk to pay bills. That's called being practical. You took something from my apartment without permission. That's called stealing." I walked back to my bed and picked up one of Aunt Patty's investment statements, looking at numbers that represented 40 years of the kind of financial discipline my family had never even attempted. "And that old junk was worth more than you'll ever know." "What's that supposed to mean?" I almost told him. For a moment, I was tempted to explain about the key, the storage unit, the investment portfolio worth millions of dollars that they'd nearly destroyed through their casual disregard for my property. The irony was so perfect, so complete, that part of me wanted them to understand exactly how catastrophically they'd miscalculated. But Aunt Patty's letter had been clear about keeping wealth private until I was ready to use it wisely. Revealing the inheritance now, while they were in crisis mode, would only create new problems. They'd expect immediate relief from their financial troubles, followed by ongoing support that would prevent them from ever learning to manage money responsibly. They'd turn my inheritance into their safety net, just like they'd turned my income into their emergency fund. "It means you had no right to touch my things," I said instead. "And I'm not fixing the problems you created by violating my trust." "The electricity workers are hooking up the equipment," Mom called from the background. "They're really going to do it, Sarah." Dad's voice took on the tone he'd used when I was 12, and it disappointed him in some fundamental way. "You're really going to let us sit in the dark because you're upset about an old jewelry box? I'm going to let you experience the consequences of your choices, just like Aunt Patty would have wanted." I hung up before he could respond, then immediately turned off my phone. Whatever happened next at the house in Maple Grove would happen without my participation or my money. The silence in my apartment felt different now, charged with possibility instead of emptiness. I made coffee and returned to Aunt Patty's papers, reading about investment strategies and compound interest, and the mathematics of patience. She'd started with $1,200 in 1981, money her own grandmother had left her, and she'd turned it into millions through consistent saving and careful decision-making. Every page I read reinforced the same lesson. Wealth wasn't created by luck or inheritance or quick schemes. It was created by spending less than you earned, investing the difference, and repeating that process for decades, while ignoring the temptation to spend money on things that didn't matter. My family had never learned that lesson, because they'd never had to learn it. Every time their poor decisions created consequences, someone stepped in to soften the impact. First it had been their parents, then various siblings, and finally me. They'd never experienced the full weight of their choices, because someone was always there to share the load. But enablement wasn't kindness. It was cruelty disguised as generosity, preventing people from developing the skills they needed to manage their own lives successfully. At 9 o'clock, I drove to First National Bank for my appointment with David Morrison. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that made small towns like Riverside look like postcards advertising the virtues of simple living. But there was nothing simple about inheriting millions of dollars or deciding how to use that inheritance responsibly. David was waiting in his office with a stack of paperwork that looked like it could choke a horse. Transfer documents, tax forms, account authorizations, investment disclosures. The bureaucracy of wealth was apparently as complicated as the accumulation of it. "Before we begin," he said, settling behind his desk with the air of someone preparing for a long conversation, "I should mention that my brother James told me about some family calls you received this morning. He was concerned that you might be under pressure to make immediate financial decisions." "You could say that." Patricia specifically mentioned this possibility in her instructions. She was worried that other family members might expect immediate access to the inheritance once you discovered it. David opened Aunt Patty's file and pulled out a sealed envelope I hadn't seen before. "She left this for you, with instructions that I should give it to you only if it became relevant." The envelope was marked for Sarah Family Pressure, in Aunt Patty's careful handwriting. Inside was another letter, shorter than the first but more direct in its advice. "My dear Sarah," it began, "if you're reading this, it means your family has learned about the inheritance and is pressuring you to share it immediately. This doesn't surprise me. What might surprise you is that this pressure is actually a gift, an opportunity to establish the boundaries that will determine how this wealth affects your relationships for the rest of your life." I looked up at David, who was watching my expression with professional interest. "Did she discuss this scenario with you?" "Extensively. Patricia was very concerned about creating dependency rather than independence. She'd watched your family's financial patterns for years, and she had strong opinions about enabling versus helping." I returned to the letter. "The most important decision you'll make isn't how to invest this money, but how to protect it from people who will always have emergencies that seem more urgent than your long-term security. Every family has these people. They create crises through poor planning, then expect others to solve those crises through good planning." The accuracy of Aunt Patty's prediction was almost eerie. She'd understood my family's dynamics better than I had, recognized patterns I'd been too close to see clearly. "Your parents will tell you that family comes first," the letter continued. "They're right, but they're wrong about what that means. Putting family first means making decisions that strengthen the family long-term, not decisions that enable destructive patterns short-term. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is allow people to experience the full consequences of their choices." David handed me a pen and indicated the first document that required my signature. As I worked through the transfer paperwork, he explained the practical aspects of managing sudden wealth. Tax implications, investment strategies, the importance of keeping inheritance information private, until I'd had time to develop a comprehensive financial plan. "Patricia also set up a separate account," he said, pulling up information on his computer. $50,000, specifically designated for what she called strategic family assistance. Her instructions were very clear about how this money should be used. Strategic assistance? Help that encourages independence rather than creating dependence. Things like paying for job training, educational expenses, or business startup costs. But not ongoing support for people who refuse to address the root causes of their financial problems. I thought about Marcus, living in my parents' basement for 2 years, without making any apparent effort to improve his situation. About Mom and Dad, facing a utility shutoff because they'd consistently spent money they didn't have on things they didn't need. About the pattern of crises that always seemed to require someone else's money to solve. What did she think I should do if they were facing something like a utility disconnection? David consulted Aunt Patty's notes, turning pages until he found the relevant section. She anticipated that scenario specifically. Her recommendation was to offer assistance only after they'd demonstrated genuine effort to solve the problem themselves. Get quotes for budget counseling services. Research assistance programs. Apply for hardship payment plans. Show that they were treating the crisis as a learning opportunity rather than just another emergency for someone else to fix. And if they refused, then you'd know they weren't really interested in solving their financial problems, just transferring them to someone else. The wisdom of Aunt Patty's approach was becoming clearer with every document I signed. She hadn't just left me money, she'd left me a framework for using that money in ways that would strengthen, rather than weaken, the people I cared about. By noon, the basic transfer process was complete. I now had access to checking and savings accounts containing nearly $500,000, with the investment portfolio transfers scheduled to finalize over the following weeks. I was officially wealthy, though the reality of that wealth still felt abstract, like numbers on a screen that belonged to someone else's life. "There's one more thing," David said as I prepared to leave. "Patricia requested that I give you this after the transfers were complete." He handed me a small wrapped package, about the size of a jewelry box but heavier. Inside was a leather-bound journal, similar to the investment records I'd been reading but blank, except for Aunt Patty's inscription on the first page. "For Sarah," it read, "your inheritance is not just money, but the knowledge of how to make money work for you instead of working for money. Use this journal to record your own financial journey. Someday, you'll pass both the wealth and the wisdom to someone who will appreciate what they represent." I left the bank feeling like I was carrying more than paperwork and account numbers. I was carrying the responsibility of stewarding wealth that had been built through decades of sacrifice and discipline, the obligation to use it wisely rather than squandering it on people who would never learn to build wealth themselves. My phone, which I'd turned back on during the bank meeting, showed 17 missed calls and 23 text messages. The family crisis had apparently escalated significantly during the 3 hours I'd been unreachable. The messages told a story of mounting desperation. The electricity had been shut off as promised. The house was now without power, which meant no lights, no refrigeration, no heat as autumn temperatures dropped. Mom had called every family member she could think of, looking for someone willing to pay the electric bill. None of them had the resources to help with a $300 emergency. Marcus had apparently applied for a cash advance from a payday lending company, but his lack of employment made him ineligible. Dad had tried to negotiate a payment plan with the utility company, but their account was too far behind for standard hardship programs. The final message, sent just 20 minutes earlier, was from Mom. "We're going to have to go to a shelter tonight. I hope you're satisfied." I read that message 3 times, feeling the familiar tug of guilt and responsibility that had shaped most of my adult decisions. They were going to a shelter. My family, people I loved despite their flaws, were facing homelessness because they couldn't come up with $300 and I'd refused to help. But then I thought about Aunt Patty's letter, about the difference between help that strengthened and help that weakened, about the $50,000 set aside specifically for strategic assistance, and the conditions that came with accessing it. I drove to the house in Maple Grove, not to give them money, but to offer them something more valuable. A path forward that didn't involve repeated crises and emergency rescues. The house looked different without electricity, darker and somehow smaller, like a building that had been abandoned rather than just temporarily disconnected from utilities. Dad's truck was in the driveway, along with Marcus's old sedan that barely ran on good days. I knocked on the front door, which felt strange after decades of walking in without announcement. Mom answered immediately, as if she'd been waiting by the door for someone to rescue them. "Sarah, thank God." Her eyes were red from crying, her usual composure completely shattered. "Have you come to help us?" "I've come to offer you an opportunity to help yourselves." She stepped back, confusion replacing relief. "What does that mean?" It means I'm willing to pay your electric bill, but only as part of a larger plan to prevent this from happening again. Dad appeared in the hallway behind her, looking older and more defeated than I'd ever seen him. What kind of plan? Financial counseling, budget planning, a serious examination of your spending habits, and a commitment to changing them. I pulled a business card from my pocket, something David Morrison had given me during our meeting. This is a non-profit organization that helps families develop financial stability. They offer free counseling, debt management programs, assistance with budgeting and planning. We don't need counseling, Dad said. We need money. No, you need skills. Money is just a temporary solution to a permanent problem. I held out the business card, which neither of them took. Call them today. Schedule an appointment. Complete their initial assessment program. Show me that you're serious about addressing the root causes of your financial problems, and I'll pay not just the electric bill, but also help you get caught up on other overdue accounts. And if we don't, Mom's voice was barely above a whisper, then you'll figure out your own solutions, just like millions of other adults do every day. Marcus appeared from the kitchen, looking like he'd been sleeping in his clothes for several days. This is insane, Sarah. They're your parents. You can't just let them lose their house over some principle. The house isn't in danger, I said calmly. The electricity is shut off, not the mortgage. They can restore power as soon as they pay the bill and demonstrate that they have a plan to keep it on. Where are they supposed to get $300? The same place everyone else gets emergency money, savings accounts, emergency funds. Resources they should have built up over the years, instead of spending every dollar they earned plus some they hadn't earned yet. Marcus opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off. And before you lecture me about family obligations, maybe you should consider what your obligations are. You're 31 years old, living rent-free in their house, contributing nothing to household expenses while they struggle to pay basic bills. If anyone should be solving this crisis, it's you. I don't have a job. Then get one, today. Any job. Minimum wage is better than no wage. And any contribution is better than no contribution. I looked at all three of them, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in my adult life. You've spent years treating my success as your safety net. That stops now. From this point forward, I'll help people who are helping themselves, but I won't enable people who refuse to take responsibility for their own lives. The silence that followed was heavy, with years of unspoken resentments and expectations. They'd assumed my generosity was unlimited, that my resources existed primarily for the purpose of solving their problems. I'd assumed my help was actually helping, rather than preventing them from developing the skills they needed to help themselves. The counseling service is open until 5 o'clock, I said, heading toward the door. Call them before then, schedule an appointment for this week, and text me the confirmation. Do that, and I'll pay your electric bill tonight. Don't do that, and you'll spend tonight wherever people spend nights when they haven't planned ahead. I left them standing in their powerless house, holding a business card that represented a choice between continued dependency and actual independence. Whatever they decided would tell me everything I needed to know about whether they were ready to change, or just looking for someone else to manage the consequences of their choices. The drive home took me past downtown Riverside, past the library where Aunt Patty had worked for 30 years, past the bank where her carefully accumulated wealth was now being transferred into my name. I thought about the lessons embedded in every document she'd left me, the wisdom that went far beyond investment strategies and compound interest. Real wealth wasn't just about having money. It was about understanding the relationship between choices and consequences. About building resources slowly and protecting them carefully. About using prosperity to create more prosperity, rather than subsidizing other people's financial chaos. Most importantly, it was about recognizing that the most generous thing you could do for people you loved was to refuse to enable their self-destructive behaviors, even when that refusal felt cruel in the short term. At 4:15, my phone buzzed with a text from Mom. It contained a confirmation number for an appointment with the financial counseling service, scheduled for the following Tuesday at 10 in the morning. I immediately transferred the money to pay their electric bill, along with enough extra to catch up their water and gas accounts. But I also opened Aunt Patty's blank journal and made my first entry, recording not just the financial transaction, but the conditions that had made it possible. This was how wealth was protected and wisdom was passed down, not through unlimited generosity, but through strategic assistance that encouraged growth instead of dependency. Not by solving other people's problems, but by helping them develop the skills to solve their own problems. 6 months later, I was sitting in the kitchen of my new house, a restored Victorian that I'd bought with cash from Aunt Patty's inheritance. The jewelry box sat on the counter in its familiar spot, but now it was surrounded by investment statements and financial planning documents that bore my name instead of hers. Mom and Dad had completed the financial counseling program and developed their first realistic budget in decades. Dad had taken a part-time job at a hardware store, not because he needed the money for survival, but because he'd discovered the dignity that came from contributing to his own security. Marcus had moved out of their basement and into a small apartment he could afford with his new job at a delivery company. They still faced financial challenges, but they were managing those challenges themselves instead of expecting someone else to manage them. The crisis that had seemed so urgent, so impossible to solve without immediate rescue, had become a turning point that led to actual improvement in their lives. The real inheritance Aunt Patty had left me wasn't the money, though the money was certainly transformative. It was the understanding that true generosity meant empowering people to succeed, rather than enabling them to fail comfortably. The jewelry box that my family had sold for $45 had been worth nearly $4 million, but the lessons it had taught me about boundaries, consequences, and the difference between helping and enabling were priceless. Sometimes the most valuable thing you could inherit was the wisdom to know when to say no. The confirmation text arrived at exactly 4:17 that Thursday afternoon, just 43 minutes before the financial counseling office closed for the day. Mom had managed to schedule their appointment for the following Tuesday at 10 in the morning, which meant they'd taken my ultimatum seriously enough to act immediately, rather than spend the evening debating whether my conditions were reasonable. I stared at the message for a long moment, surprised by the relief I felt. Part of me had expected them to choose pride over practicality, to reject my offer, rather than admit they needed professional help managing money. The fact that they'd swallowed that pride, at least temporarily, suggested they might finally be ready to address the root causes of their financial chaos, instead of just treating the symptoms. I transferred the money for their electric bill that evening, along with enough additional funds to cover their overdue water and gas accounts. But this time, the transaction felt different than all the previous bailouts I'd provided over the years. This wasn't enabling disguised as generosity. This was strategic assistance, designed to create lasting change rather than temporary relief. More importantly, I opened Aunt Patty's blank journal and recorded my first entry, documenting not just the financial details but the philosophy behind them. October 15th, I wrote. Paid $547 for utility restoration, conditional on family completing financial counseling program. This represents investment in their independence, rather than subsidy for their dependence. Goal is to teach skills that prevent future crises, rather than simply solving current crisis. The act of writing those words made the shift in my thinking feel permanent and deliberate. I wasn't just changing how I responded to my family's emergencies. I was changing how I thought about money, responsibility, and the difference between love and enablement. Friday morning brought a call from James Morrison at the bank, informing me that the final investment account transfers had been completed ahead of schedule. I was now the official owner of a portfolio worth $2 million, plus cash accounts totaling nearly $500,000, plus antique furniture and collectibles valued at another $400,000. The numbers were so large they felt abstract, like statistics about someone else's life rather than concrete reality about my own. There's one final item, James said. Your aunt left a sealed envelope with instructions that it should be given to you exactly 1 week after the inheritance transfer was completed. Would you like to pick it up today, or should I schedule an appointment with David to go over it together? I'll come in this morning. The envelope was thicker than the previous letters Aunt Patty had left, sealed with old-fashioned wax that bore the impression of a signet ring I remembered seeing on her finger during family gatherings. Inside were several documents, including what appeared to be the deed to a property I'd never heard her mention. Riverside Community Gardens, the deed read. 2 acres of undeveloped land on the east side of town, purchased 1987, designated for charitable use, upon transfer to Sarah Chen. Attached to the deed was a detailed proposal, written in Aunt Patty's careful handwriting, outlining her vision for transforming the empty lot into a community resource. Vegetable gardens for families who couldn't afford fresh produce. Educational programs about financial literacy and sustainable living. A meeting space for nonprofit organizations serving low-income residents. I've been quietly acquiring properties around Riverside for 30 years, her accompanying letter explained. Not as investments for profit, but as opportunities to create lasting positive change in our community. This land represents my final gift to you, but also my final challenge. Wealth that isn't used to improve the world is just hoarding with better documentation. The scope of Aunt Patty's vision was breathtaking. She'd identified specific needs in Riverside's low-income neighborhoods and developed concrete plans for addressing them. The community garden was just the beginning. She'd also outlined ideas for a financial literacy center, a small business incubator, and a microloan program for people who couldn't access traditional banking services. You have the resources now to implement these programs, the letter continued, but more importantly, you have the judgment to implement them correctly. Don't just throw money at problems. Invest in solutions that empower people to solve their own problems. Teach people to fish instead of giving them fish, even when giving fish feels more immediately satisfying. I spent the entire weekend reading through Aunt Patty's community development proposals, cross-referencing her ideas with current research about effective poverty reduction strategies. Her approaches were sophisticated, evidence-based, designed to create sustainable improvement rather than temporary relief. She'd studied successful programs in other communities and adapted them specifically for Riverside's demographics and resources. Most impressive was her understanding of how individual financial stability connected to community economic health. The families who learned to budget and save would have more money to spend at local businesses. The people who developed job skills through training programs would contribute more to the local tax base. The community gardens would reduce food costs while improving nutrition, which would reduce healthcare expenses while increasing productivity. Everything was interconnected, designed to create positive feedback loops that strengthened the entire community rather than just helping individual families survive from crisis to crisis. On Monday evening, I drove out to see the land Aunt Patty had left me. The lot sat at the intersection of 2 residential streets in a neighborhood where most of the houses needed paint, and many of the yards were brown from lack of irrigation. Children played in the street because there wasn't a safe playground within walking distance. Adults sat on front porches in the evening heat because air conditioning was too expensive to run during peak hours. The land itself was unremarkable, 2 acres of grass and weeds surrounded by chain-link fencing. But standing there in the fading light, I could see what Aunt Patty had envisioned. Raised garden beds where families could grow their own vegetables. A pavilion where financial literacy classes could be held on summer evenings. Play areas where children could be safe, while their parents attended educational programs. Most importantly, I could see how the project would create connections between people who shared similar challenges but had been facing them in isolation. The single mother struggling to feed her children on a minimum wage salary. The elderly man trying to stretch his Social Security benefits through the month. The young couple saving for a house down payment while living paycheck to paycheck. All of them could benefit from shared resources, shared knowledge, shared support systems that made individual struggles feel less overwhelming and more manageable. Tuesday morning arrived with a phone call from Mom, her voice cautious but hopeful in a way I hadn't heard in years. She and Dad had attended their first appointment with the financial counseling service, and the experience had apparently been illuminating in ways they hadn't expected. The counselor showed us how to track our expenses, Mom said. We thought we knew where our money was going, but when we actually wrote it all down, we discovered we were spending almost $200 a month on things we didn't even realize we were buying. Like what? Convenience store purchases, coffee shop visits, impulse buys at the grocery store. Little things that seemed insignificant but added up to major money over time. She paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. She also helped us understand the difference between needs and wants. We've been treating wants like needs for so long that we forgot there was a difference. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Mom explaining budgeting concepts and financial planning strategies like someone who'd just discovered a new language. For the first time in my adult life, she sounded excited about managing money rather than stressed about not having enough of it. The counselor wants us to come back next week with a complete list of our debts and a proposed budget for the next 6 months, Mom continued. She said if we can stick to the budget for 3 months, we might qualify for a debt consolidation program that would reduce our monthly payments significantly. That sounds like a good plan. Sarah, I want you to know that this whole experience has made me realize how much pressure we've been putting on you over the years. We kept treating our poor planning as your emergency, and that wasn't fair to any of us. The apology was simple, direct, and more meaningful than any elaborate explanation would have been. Mom had recognized the pattern that had damaged our relationship and taken responsibility for changing it. That recognition was worth more than any amount of money I'd ever transferred into their accounts. I'm proud of you for getting help, I said. Real help, not just temporary fixes. Your father is actually excited about this, she said, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. He's been researching part-time jobs for people his age, and he found out that the hardware store downtown needs someone with his mechanical skills. The pay isn't much, but he likes the idea of contributing something instead of just managing our decline. Wednesday brought another call, this one from Marcus. His voice sounded different, less defensive and more thoughtful than I'd heard since high school. I applied for 6 jobs yesterday, he said without preamble. Delivery driver positions, mostly, but also a warehouse job and something at the post office. I figured if I'm going to live like an adult, I should probably start acting like one. That's a big step. Mom told me about the counseling appointment, about how they discovered they were spending money on stuff they didn't even remember buying. It made me realize I've been doing the same thing, except instead of spending money I don't have, I've been spending time I can't get back. Marcus had always been articulate when he chose to be, but this level of self-reflection was new. The crisis that had forced our family to examine their financial habits had apparently also forced him to examine his life choices more broadly. I found an apartment I can afford if I get one of these jobs, he continued. It's small, but it's mine. And the landlord said if I can provide a letter of employment and first month's rent, I can move in next weekend. What changed your mind about staying with Mom and Dad? Watching them get excited about budgeting and planning made me realize I don't have any plans at all. I've been drifting for 2 years, waiting for something to happen instead of making something happen. He paused, and I could hear traffic in the background, suggesting he was walking rather than lying in bed, which was itself a significant change. I don't want to be 40 years old and still living in their basement because I never bothered to build a life of my own. Thursday evening found me back at the community garden site, this time with a local contractor who'd agreed to provide estimates for the infrastructure improvements Aunt Patty had outlined in her proposal. The man, whose name was Bill Rodriguez, and who'd apparently known Aunt Patty through some previous project, walked the property with the careful attention of someone who understood that good planning prevented expensive mistakes. Your aunt knew what she was talking about, he said, studying her detailed drawings for the garden layout. This design would handle drainage issues, provide adequate sun exposure for most vegetables, and create natural gathering spaces that would encourage community interaction. How long would a project like this take to complete? If we start with basic infrastructure, maybe 3 months. Water lines, electrical service, the pavilion structure, and initial garden bed construction. But this is the kind of project that would grow over time, as more people got involved, and additional funding became available. Bill handed me a preliminary estimate that was substantial but not overwhelming, especially considering the scale of resources now available to me. More importantly, his timeline would allow the community garden to be operational by spring planting season, which would maximize its impact during the first year of operation. The real question, he continued, is whether you've got community support for something like this. Projects like this succeed when local people feel ownership of them, not when they're imposed from outside by well-meaning donors. That observation led me to spend Friday evening attending a neighborhood association meeting in the elementary school closest to the garden site. The meeting was sparsely attended, maybe 20 people scattered across a cafeteria designed for 200, but the conversation was intense and focused on exactly the kinds of issues Aunt Patty's project was designed to address. Food insecurity, lack of affordable recreation options for children, limited access to financial education and job training programs, transportation barriers that made it difficult for low-income residents to access services located in other parts of town. When I introduced myself and described the community garden proposal, the response was immediate and enthusiastic. These weren't people looking for charity. They were people looking for opportunities to improve their own situations with appropriate support and resources. My grandmother had a garden when I was growing up, said a woman named Maria Santos, who worked 2 part-time jobs and was raising 3 children in a neighborhood where fresh vegetables were expensive and hard to find. She taught me how to grow tomatoes and peppers, but I've never had space to plant anything myself. Something like this would be amazing for families like mine. An elderly man named Robert Kim, who'd been laid off from his factory job 2 years earlier and was struggling to make his unemployment benefits cover basic expenses, raised his hand to ask about the financial literacy component of the program. "I've never been good with money management," he admitted. "I always figured if I worked hard and paid my bills on time, everything else would take care of itself. But when you're living on a fixed income, you need actual skills, not just good intentions." The meeting ended with 17 people signing up for email updates about the garden project and 12 volunteering to help with initial construction and planning. More importantly, it ended with my understanding that Aunt Patty had been right about the connection between individual financial stability and community economic health. These weren't people who needed someone else to solve their problems. They were people who needed resources and education that would allow them to solve their own problems more effectively. Saturday morning brought the first significant test of my family's commitment to their new financial approach. Dad called to inform me that their car had developed a transmission problem that would cost $800 to repair properly or $300 to fix temporarily. "The mechanic says the temporary fix might last 6 months or 6 days, Dad explained. "There's no way to predict it. But we can't afford the permanent repair right now, even with the budget counseling." In the past, this would have been exactly the kind of emergency that resulted in an immediate transfer from my checking account to theirs. A crisis with a clear solution that only required money I could easily afford to provide. But Aunt Patty's letters had been explicit about distinguishing between problems that required financial assistance and problems that required creative problem solving. "What are your options?" I asked. "Well, we could take the temporary fix and hope it lasts until we've saved enough for the permanent repair. Or we could look into financing options, though our credit isn't great. Or," he hesitated, "we could consider whether we actually need a car right now." The hesitation in his voice suggested he'd been thinking about alternatives that would have been unthinkable just a week earlier. Dad had owned a car continuously since he'd turned 16, and the idea of voluntarily giving up that independence would normally have been inconceivable. What would not having a car look like? "Your mother could walk to work, it's only about 12 blocks. I could bike to the hardware store when I start working there next week. We could use public transit for grocery shopping and medical appointments. It would be inconvenient, but it might actually save us money compared to maintaining an old car that needs constant repairs." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Dad working through the logistics of car-free living with the same methodical approach he'd once applied to mechanical problems at the factory. He wasn't asking me to solve his transportation crisis. He was asking me to help him think through solutions he could implement himself. "I think we're going to try the temporary fix for now," he concluded. "But we're also going to start researching what it would take to live without a car permanently. If this transmission fails completely, maybe that's the universe telling us to try a different approach." Sunday evening found me sitting in my kitchen with Aunt Patty's journal open in front of me, reviewing the week's events and planning the next steps for both the community garden project and my family's ongoing financial education. The jewelry box sat in its familiar place on the counter, but now it was surrounded by architectural drawings, budget spreadsheets, and contractor estimates that represented possibilities Aunt Patty had envisioned but left for me to implement. The magnitude of the responsibility was both thrilling and intimidating. I had the resources to create meaningful change in my community and my family, but I also had the obligation to use those resources wisely, rather than squandering them on gestures that felt good, but didn't create lasting improvement. More than that, I had the opportunity to honor Aunt Patty's legacy by applying the lessons she'd embedded in every aspect of my inheritance. Patience over immediate gratification, strategic thinking over emotional reactions, empowerment over enablement, investment in people's capacity to help themselves rather than subsidy for their willingness to remain helpless. Monday morning brought an email from David Morrison with quarterly statements showing how Aunt Patty's investment portfolio had performed during the month since her death. Despite market volatility, the careful diversification she'd maintained had protected the principal value while generating enough income to fund both the community garden project and ongoing family assistance without touching the core investments. The mathematics of wealth preservation were becoming clearer to me as I studied her allocation strategies and read the financial education materials David had recommended. Aunt Patty hadn't just been lucky or privileged. She'd been disciplined and patient in ways that transformed modest savings into substantial security over decades of consistent effort. That afternoon, I received a text from Mom with a photo of a handwritten budget that she and Dad had developed with their financial counselor's guidance. Every category was carefully defined, every expense justified, every allocation designed to prioritize needs over wants, while still leaving room for modest pleasures that made frugal living sustainable rather than punitive. First month we've ever had a plan for our money instead of just hoping it would last until payday, the accompanying message read. It feels strange but also exciting to know where every dollar is supposed to go. Tuesday brought news that Marcus had been hired for the delivery job and would start work on Thursday. More importantly, he'd signed a lease for the small apartment and planned to move out of my parents' house by the weekend. His text message was brief but significant. Got the job? Moving Saturday. Thanks for not making this easy. That final sentence captured something important about the difference between help that strengthened and help that weakened. Making their crisis easy to solve would have prevented them from developing the skills they needed to prevent future crises. Making it challenging but achievable had forced them to discover capabilities they didn't know they possessed. Wednesday afternoon found me at the neighborhood school again, this time for a planning meeting with the volunteers who'd signed up to help develop the community garden. The energy in the room was infectious, with people sharing ideas for educational programs, fundraising strategies, and partnership opportunities with local businesses and organizations. Maria Santos had researched grant programs that supported community agriculture projects and discovered that our initiative might qualify for significant funding if we could demonstrate community engagement and sustainable planning. Robert Kim had connected with other unemployed residents who were interested in using garden work as a pathway to developing marketable landscaping and agriculture skills. Most encouraging was the emergence of natural leadership among community members who saw the garden not as charity being provided to them, but as an opportunity they were creating for themselves with appropriate support. This isn't just about growing vegetables, Maria explained to the group. It's about growing connections between neighbors who've been struggling with similar problems in isolation. When people work together on something positive, they start sharing resources and knowledge that help everyone succeed. The meeting ended with committees forming around different aspects of the project: site preparation, educational programming, community outreach, and ongoing maintenance. Each committee included both volunteers from the neighborhood and professionals with relevant expertise who'd heard about the project and wanted to contribute their skills. By Thursday evening, I was beginning to understand why Aunt Patty had been so excited about the community garden concept. It wasn't just a way to provide fresh vegetables to families who couldn't afford them at grocery store prices. It was a framework for building the kinds of social connections and shared resources that helped people solve problems collectively, instead of struggling alone. Friday brought an unexpected call from Dorothy at the storage facility, informing me that she'd been contacted by someone claiming to be Aunt Patty's nephew and demanding access to the storage unit. The caller had apparently become agitated when Dorothy explained that the unit contents had already been transferred to the legal heir and threatened to involve lawyers if his demands weren't met immediately. I didn't give him any information about you, Dorothy assured me, but he seemed to know quite a bit about Patricia's financial situation. He kept talking about family members who deserved to inherit her wealth and how it wasn't fair for everything to go to just one person. The caller was almost certainly Trevor, my cousin who'd attended Aunt Patty's funeral but hadn't been mentioned in her will. Trevor had always been the family member who showed up during crises expecting other people to solve his problems, and he'd apparently learned about my inheritance through family conversations and decided he deserved a share. Did he mention any specific legal action? He said he was going to contest the will and demand a full accounting of all assets. He also said something about family members having a right to inherit from relatives, regardless of what official documents said. Trevor's threats were almost certainly empty bluster from someone who didn't understand how inheritance law actually worked, but they represented exactly the kind of family pressure Aunt Patty had warned me about in her letters. People who'd never contributed to building wealth, but felt entitled to benefit from wealth that others had accumulated through discipline and sacrifice. Saturday morning brought a more serious development: a certified letter from a law office representing Trevor, formally demanding access to Aunt Patty's financial records and challenging the validity of her will. The letter was full of legal-sounding language about undue influence and diminished capacity, but was clearly written by someone who didn't actually expect to win in court. Instead, it was an intimidation tactic designed to pressure me into voluntarily sharing the inheritance, rather than dealing with the expense and stress of defending it through the legal system. I forwarded the letter to David Morrison, who immediately connected me with the estate attorney who'd helped Aunt Patty prepare her will and testament. The attorney, a woman named Rebecca Torres who'd practiced estate law in Oregon for 25 years, reviewed Trevor's challenge and dismissed it as legally baseless but emotionally calculated. Patricia's will was meticulously prepared and thoroughly documented, Rebecca explained during our phone consultation. She was of sound mind, she wasn't under any undue influence, and she had every right to distribute her assets as she chose. This challenge has no legal merit whatsoever. So why file it? Because your cousin is hoping you'll settle rather than fight. He's gambling that you'd rather give him some money than spend time and energy defending your legitimate inheritance. Rebecca paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. The question is whether you want to ignore this completely or respond in a way that discourages future challenges. We decided on a measured response that would demonstrate the strength of my legal position without escalating the conflict unnecessarily. Rebecca would file a motion to dismiss Trevor's challenge while documenting the frivolous nature of his claims, creating a legal record that would discourage similar attempts by other family members who might be inspired by his example. More importantly, she helped me understand that Aunt Patty had anticipated exactly this scenario and structured her estate planning to minimize the possibility of successful challenges. Every document was properly witnessed. Every decision was clearly explained. Every asset transfer was legally bulletproof. Patricia told me she expected some family members to feel entitled to her wealth regardless of how little they'd contributed to her life, Rebecca explained. She was very specific about wanting her inheritance to go to someone who would use it responsibly rather than distributing it among people who would squander it immediately. Sunday evening found me back at my kitchen table with Aunt Patty's journal, recording not just the week's financial transactions but the broader lessons about wealth, family, and responsibility that each challenge had revealed. Trevor's legal threat was just another test of my commitment to using the inheritance according to Aunt Patty's values, rather than other people's expectations. The community garden project was moving forward with enthusiasm and community support that exceeded my most optimistic predictions. My parents were developing genuine financial management skills that would prevent future crises, rather than just postponing them. Marcus was taking responsibility for his own life, instead of expecting others to provide structure and support indefinitely. Most importantly, I was learning to distinguish between problems that required my resources and problems that required other people's growth. Aunt Patty's wealth was powerful, not because it could solve every challenge instantly, but because it could be used strategically to create lasting, positive change for people who were ready to change. The jewelry box that my family had sold for $45 had unlocked an inheritance worth millions, but the real treasure was the wisdom to use that inheritance in ways that honored both the sacrifice that had created it and the potential of the people it could help empower. 3 months later, as I stood in the completed community garden watching families harvest vegetables they'd grown themselves while attending financial literacy classes in the pavilion Aunt Patty had envisioned, I understood that the most valuable thing she'd left me wasn't money. It was the knowledge that true wealth meant having the resources to help people help themselves, and the wisdom to know the difference between help that strengthened and help that weakened. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.